This being the opening of football season, tell a story that a friend of mine, another priest, told me. He said there was a fellow out at Chief Stadium one day, and he was watching the game, but he was up in the nosebleed area, and he had his binoculars there, and so he was watching with his binoculars, and he was panning the fans, and he noticed there in the club area there was an empty seat next to this man. And so he decided, and he kept watching, and he said, no, nobody's coming to sit in that seat. So halftime, after the ushers were not paying that much attention, he goes over there and he gets in the club area and he goes down and he says to the man there, he says, I notice there's an empty seat here. Can I sit in this seat? And the man said, well, yeah. He says, that's my wife's seat. He says, oh. He said, but you can sit in it. And he said, okay. So he sat down, and he said, well, he said, you know, my wife and I are wonderful fans. He says, we had these seats for 30 years, and we have not missed a football game in 30 years because we're such tremendous fans of the Chiefs. And so he said, well, where's your wife today? And he said, oh, she died. And he says, oh, that's terrible. That's terrible that she died. And I'm so sorry to hear that. But you would think you would have asked one of your relatives or friends to come and take her seat today. And he said, yeah, they couldn't do it. They're all at the funeral. That's radical dedication to the Chiefs. Jesus in the gospel today is talking about radical discipleship, which is something even much greater than that dedication to our football teams. Jesus makes some very challenging statements today. He said, you can't be my disciple unless you hate your mother, your father, hate your wife and your children. And you say, wait a second, Jesus, what are you saying here? How can you really mean this? And I believe what Jesus is really saying is that we can't be mediocre disciples. There needs to be a radical discipleship in our life. And radical means not extremism, but it means being rooted fundamentally in our faith in God. That's what it's about. And it's about living that faith in God in a faithful, radical way. And that's the challenge that Jesus is saying. He's really not telling us that we need to hate our relatives, our friends. That's Semitic hyperbole in order to get the point across. But what he's saying is that we must really be fully dedicated to God above all else. Jesus never enjoined hate because his commandment is that of love. Love of neighbor as well as the love of God. And so Jesus is not telling us it's about hate, but rather it truly is about love. And that we are called to be so radically dedicated to truth and to love, to the truth that is revealed by God about our lives and our relationship with him and the meaning and the purpose of our life. We're called to live that truth with a radical sense of commitment, and to live that life of love that is truly self-giving. And yet we know that both truth and love tend to be undermined in our own culture, society, and just because of our fallen human nature. We know that truth really so often today has been turned into relativism. It's whatever I believe. It's whatever I think. It's all just very relative to me. And if I don't believe it, then it doesn't exist, which really undermines that there is an objective truth revealed in Christ Jesus about our lives and our purpose and our relationship with God and with others and the real meaning and the ultimate destiny of our life. That those things are so much just dismissed these days for whatever I happen to believe. I happened to see a little sign. It was on a young woman's purse, and it said, think less, enjoy more. And I thought, interesting statement. Think less, enjoy more. And maybe that's part of the culture that we have. It's kind of an anti-thought culture. Don't think, just enjoy. And so often love is reduced to just enjoying, to just self-fulfillment, just the moment, rather than truly self-giving, self-sacrificing. And that's the reason why Jesus talks about picking up my cross and following after him. Because we all know that if we're faithful to truth, if we're faithful to self-giving love, it will be difficult. It will be challenging. There's times that we have to transcend our own personal wants and desires and needs out of love, out of self-giving towards others. And Jesus says that's not an easy trip. That's not an easy journey. And so he asks us to stop and evaluate, do I have what it takes to truly be a disciple of Jesus? And the fact of the matter is, none of us does. But God's grace is sufficient for us. And that's the crucial thing. Am I truly open to God's grace day in and day out to be truly live as a follower of Jesus, to follow that truth, to live that love in a self-giving way? Another way in which this is expressed sometimes is, I'm third. God first, family and others second, and I'm third. That's a pretty good philosophy of life. That's a good approach to our Christian discipleship, to recognize truly I am called to love. Love God above all things, love my neighbor, and then love myself, that I may truly be loving of others. God first, others second, me third.